All right, and we're live. Now that I messed up that whole countdown, but it's all right. We'll get this figured out at some point. Anyway, so how's everybody doing today? This past week, I ended up going through and hearing some different things and looking through John Slaughter's Substack because something got me interested in that. So, wanted to jump into that because, as usual, John's right on things, but whenever he writes something, it ends up sending me down a different path and make me wonder about some bigger picture things. The big one that got me this past week was the secret of teenagerdom. Of course, why we're going to look there at the secret of Nim. I mean, how can that not get you interested? But he and we had talked a little bit about that on a stream he had done with me. I don't know, 3 weeks back or so, and we had started mentioning different pieces of this media and what that meant for us growing up and sort of what were these authors hitting at. So let's dig into this. I haven't quite figured out the format yet. I'm going to end up reading this, but then we'll see if that continues as I continue to do these live streams and sort of build up on that. So we're going to jump in on this guy, and it is The Secret of Teenagerdom: Slapification versus Infantilization. He's going to start us off. The tragedy of modern man is not that he knows less and less about the meaning of his own life, but that it bothers him less and less. Václav Havel. Now we're on to Mr. Slaughter saying, reading through Dave Green's and Alexandru Constantine's recent back and forth about the slapification versus infantilization of media debate has been quite interesting. Both men point to something fundamentally wrong with our perception of modern media. Whether it's the attempt to find meaning in content meant for children, or the obvious degradation in quality. While both Dave and Constantine make valid points, their assessment is missing a crucial factor: the phenomenon of the aging teenager. The teenager is an artificial creation of modernity. Before the 1950s, people transitioned directly from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. However, as consumerist culture took hold, it recognized the untapped monetary potential of youth. For the first time in history, society had an abundance of adolescents with expendable income, leading to the birth of an entire media ecosystem designed to market and sell movies, music, and television to them. This era saw the rise of artists like Elvis and Buddy Holly, specifically targeted at this new demographic, and with it came the term teenager. The difference between an adolescent and a teenager is not just semantic, but one of purpose and function. Adolescents, no longer children, were traditionally prepared for adulthood. They transitioned from childhood into roles of increasing responsibility, so that by 18, they were getting married and having children by their early 20s. In contrast, the teenager represents a form of arrested development. Rather than being prepared for adulthood, teenagers were freed from the expectation of responsibility and instead encouraged to focus on self-discovery and personal identity. In essence, the teenager is an extension of childhood. The greatest generation was the first generation to experience this phenomenon. Yet it is the boomers who grew up with the teenager as a social norm, and this extended adolescence manifested in the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. However, they still carry traces of older adolescent culture and were never fully immersed into the cult of the teenager. That transformation would reach its full potential with their children, the millennials. From the boomers onward, an entire media industry emerged to capitalize on youth culture. The financial incentives were too great to ignore, and soon even childhood itself was monetized. The first generation creating media for children has been raised in an adolescent culture, so they still infuse their work with moral and ethical lessons necessary for adulthood. Films like Watership Down and The Secret of Nim exemplify this mindset. Though targeted at children, they contain deep, meaningful lessons about human nature, life, and responsibility. Essentially, adult stories packaged for younger audiences. These stand in stark contrast to today's children's media, a shift driven by the gradual replacement of those with adolescence residue by those baptized in teenagerdom. Goodness gracious. With each passing generation, arrested development has only intensified. Despite pioneering teenagerdom, boomers were still forced to grow up at a relatively normal pace. They got married in their late teens, had children in their early 20s, and started careers. Generation X extended this timeline into their late 20s, with college serving as an extension of youthful self discovery. By the time millennials came of age, youth had been prolonged well into their early 30s. And this is Slaughter writing, I am in the minority among my generation. At 37, I am married with children, the eldest of whom is approaching 13. Most of my peers, however, are in their mid-30s, unmarried and childless. They've not grown up. They still party and live attachmentless, and outside of their careers, they behave much as they did as teenagers, only with more money. Boomers let go of childish things early, Gen X a little later, and millennials not at all. The result? We now have media produced by adults who think and act like teenagers, consumed by adults who never grew up. They seek adult themes and toys that they never put away. When Dave sees slop in today's media, it's because he's looking for meaning and content made for adults by emotionally stunted adults. This stands in stark contrast to the media of our youth, which Constantine is also correct when he says we are searching for value in what is, at its core, a child's toy. However, that toy has also degraded in quality to what Dave rightly calls slopification. Ultimately, this debate is not just about media, but about the cultural consequences of prolonged adolescence. As each generation extends their youth... Oh, man. I don't know how I keep getting lost on here. Let's see. What we see today is not just a decline in quality, but a fundamental shift in purpose. Stories once meant to prepare the young for adulthood are now created by and for those who refuse to grow up. In the end, both Dave and Constantine are right, but their perspectives are two sides of the same coin. A culture that refuses to put away childish things and no longer understands how to make them meaningful. All right. So that was the article. And I think in and of itself, Slaughter's correct. My issue with it, if it's a legitimate issue, is that I think he's got a little bit of his cohort is selection bias. And so I think at any given time in the different decades, you could have made the argument the other way. Now, in fairness to him, again, we're always messing with the aggregate and the big picture. And so the big picture is, yes, we can notice these things and say that what he wrote about is correct, that there's this sense of arrested development and that the teenager has taken the reins, which is true. But what I find particularly curious is that this idea that good media is always going to be good media, and that we're always going to have examples of a positive lifestyle in media. And so we start getting this weird chicken and egg deal going on. And should we be focused right now on sort of this Uncle Ted idea that this is the continuation of life that deals with electricity and an easier life taking hold that's affecting us? And then you also get into, does art influence culture, or does culture influence art? Who's there sitting on the edge? What is the avant-garde movement? And then what's just its thin continuation by the merchant class? And so it's difficult when I read these things and trying to understand them and tease out exactly what's going on. And potentially it's not even worth teasing out, because again, in broad strokes, I mean, John's right, but it made me think, and I started going back through 80s and 90s cartoons, and unfortunately I couldn't find any ratings or anything, and so I don't know what was the most watched. But I went and Googled most watched cartoons in the 80s, and it's popping up He-Man, it's popping up the Ninja Turtles, Thundercats. The big one that I was curious about that popped into my mind as I was reading John's stuff was G.I. Joe, which, let's see, 1983. 1983 on G.I. Joe. In particular, what made me wonder about that is because there's no getting around the fact that, yes, it's pro-America, pro-nationalism, whatever, but there's a, national existence, excuse me. But there's certainly the idea there of responsibility and taking care of each other. And you've got the same in Ninja Turtles. I'm not too familiar with He-Man. But when we start looking at these dates, 1987, if we're saying that the boomers ended in 1964, the youngest person working on that, Ninja Turtles, is clearly going to be a boomer, because at that point, 1964, quick math, blah, yeah, 23 years old. What's curious about that is that when I looked up both Eastman and Laird, they're both boomers. Laird clearly so. Kevin Eastman was very early on. I mean, he was a rock star to some degree very early in his life, because I want to say he was born in 62 to 87. 25 years old, and the man is already getting royalties checks well into the thousands and hundreds of thousands. When we go, though, and we move from the 1980s into the 1990s, we see Batman the Animated Series, and that's really the only one that stuck with this idea of personal responsibility. This couldn't be, it certainly couldn't be the millennials working on this, but even with the Gen Xers, if we're saying it ended in 1964, Batman started in 1992. So what is that, 28 years old? Is my math? Yeah. 28 years old. And so they can be working on this, but they're not going to be making the actual decisions on what's airing. Just like back here on He-Man and G.I. Joe and the Turtles, they're not going to be making the decisions that are airing, and all they can do is work on a project when they're in their, especially in their younger 20s, but moving up towards 30, they're still not making a lot of executive decisions or choosing what's going on in the different viewing blocks. And so we have this weird catch-up going on in media, in that ideas can be pushed, especially on the fringe, within the underground scene, so to speak. You'll find different ideas, and that's part of what went on with LGBTQ and all that going through the past few decades. Is you had the underground movement that's pushing these things, and it wasn't until it was economically viable in the late 80s, moving in through the 90s, and then certainly in the 2000s, that you saw the big studios picking up and inserting these things. And so I've moved past or outside. I shouldn't say past, but I've moved outside of what John was talking about to some degree, in that he was saying we can still see the remnants of the idea of adolescence in contrast to teenagerdom. And I think his formulation of that is correct. I'm just a little bit overwhelmed. Such a goofy sounding word. I'm trying to find, though, if there is a single line through there that can direct us on what was being achieved, because I'm not convinced that it's quite as clear as he was saying. But again, the principle's there, so that makes sense. Oh, and another fun one, just totally off the blue, is just Don Bluth. I was checking him out. So what is that? Silent Generation 37? Yes, I want to say that was silent. So I was surprised about that one. Didn't realize that. Curiously, though, think what you want of Bluth, because we're moving all the way from The Secret of Nim and The Land Before Time up into Five Goes West and the American telemovies. So it's interesting, curious. I think art is honestly a hard one to nail down until it reaches a saturation level. I think that's probably my whole argument, is that saturation is it's a funny issue. And I don't know if it's as clear cut sometimes as we want to make it with art. When we have folks on the fringes that are pushing a particular idea, and then once we reach in the adoption curve some point of saturation, then then the merchants evidencing buy-in, or excuse me, seeing the evidence for buy-in, they're willing then to continue saturation and to try and profit off of it. And so again, my argument isn't that John was wrong. I just wonder how much of it is a confirmation bias of things that are beyond our complete understanding. But as always, I'm gonna talk him up. Well worth jumping into. He's got his Substack here. It's going to be Texas John Slaughter at Substack.com. I've got his info in the description. I'm hoping that that's working at this point. For all I know, YouTube still hasn't taken my links and actually made them active, but hopefully it is. It's worth reading, worth jumping into. This is not his only one worth reading. He's got a bunch of them in here. We actually we had spoken about this one again several weeks ago on the stream he and I did, Football Americana. The Lonely Future was a good read. I am so far removed from this world, though, and this understanding of dating and the trials surrounding it, that I'm going to keep my mouth shut on this one. But certainly go dig into it, see if it helps in your understanding. And like I said, just subscribe to John. It's well worth it. But moving on from that, we're going to jump back into a little bit of this Scream and Shout book that I had read from last time. Let's see if we can't find any good stories in there. So this one is going to be Injured in the Line of Duty. The commanding officer of the Marine Barracks, Naval Air Station, Alameda, California, entered his office, removed his coat, got a cup of coffee, and sat down at his desk to review the morning message traffic. He heard someone approach his office door. Looking up, he saw Sergeant Major Alfonso Bushlow and one sad-looking Marine. The Marine was on crutches and had his right leg in a thigh-high cast. He also had a bandage around his head. "Oh, shit," groaned the CO, whose shortages of guard personnel were so bad that the troops were on running guard. Go on and stay on. And now one of those had become a casualty. "Come in, Sergeant Major, and tell me what happened to this Marine." "Good morning, sir," cheerily said Bushlow. "Sir, this Marine injured himself falling off an ironing board last night." "He what?" "Yes, sir, Major. He fell off an ironing board. The barracks occupied by the Marines were but a mere part of a large barracks complex. Jutting off perpendicularly from the Marines' recreation room was a wing of the barracks which housed the Waves. It seems that the young injured Marine had been courting one of the Waves, and through some misbehavior on her part, she was restricted to the barracks. She lived on the second floor, just off the Marine recreation room. I have no idea what they're talking about with the Waves. So, some sort of acronym. I have no idea what this is. Anyway, let's see. Young Lothario decided that if he opened an ironing board and stretched it on an angle from the rec room window to the window of her room, he could crawl across and visit with her, commiserating over her restriction. He estimated that his weight of about 140 pounds would be sustained by the seemingly sturdy ironing board, at least for the few seconds he would be upon it. He waited until after taps and then constructed his bridge, and there wasn't much to spare on either end, but it seemed to have a solid bite on the window sills of both ends. He carefully began to crawl out onto the board, testing it for durability. It seemed shaky. In the meantime, his Navy lover was waiting in great anticipation. She didn't want to audibly cheer him on, as this might bring forth the authorities, and with whom she had no desire for further encounter. The young lad creeped slowly out onto the board and could feel the sudden chill of the night air mixed with his fear of heights. About that time, he had his entire weight on the board. He looked straight ahead at the window of his lover's room and observed that she had stripped to the nude in readiness for their eager rendezvous. I suppose the unexpected sight of his girlfriend in all her pristine nudity caused the Marine to throw caution to the wind as he began a fast crawl across the board. But alas, the board would not support such passion, and it folded in the middle, dropping the young heated Marine 2 stories to the deck below. He sustained a broken leg and some head lacerations, to say nothing of a severely wounded ego. The necessary injury investigation was conducted, and the findings were that he was injured in the line of duty and not due to his own misconduct. Such was the compassion of the Marine Corps in those days. Goodness gracious. Yeah, I believe it. I've seen, not that, but good gracious. I've certainly seen enough stupid things for very well. Barracks bunnies and barrack. Can you say that on YouTube? I wonder if you can say whore. Anyway, barracks whores, barracks bunnies, and they make their rounds. They make their rounds. All right, we'll do one more. Let's see where we get to. This one is the straight arrow. The lieutenant and the warrant officer had been friends for about 3 years. They received orders to Okinawa and both wound up at Camp Hansen. The warrant officer was known to be a bit of a prowler, when his infrequent absences from his wife's suspicious nature would permit such activity. Evidently, he decided to change the fiber of his moral character, and he announced to his friend, the lieutenant, one night at the officers' club that he had a proposal. "Jack, let's make a vow right now. Let's vow to be true to our wives, even though we are in Okinawa, where the opportunities to play are plentiful." "Seriously," said the warrant officer. The lieutenant, never known to cheat on his wife, was a bit amused by this semi-sober statement. He asked, "Well, what do you suggest? Maybe a little bloodletting and joined wrists, or just what?" "Well, no, nothing that painful," replied the warrant officer as he shoved his empty beer bottle toward the Okinawan bartender. "The arrow is a symbol of fidelity. Let's get 2 arrows and tape them to the doors of our barracks rooms. That will be a constant reminder that we must remain true, remain straight arrows." "Well, that sounds good. I'm game," said the lieutenant. The next night, the lieutenant noticed that a new, highly polished arrow with real feather fins. It's a weird way of saying fletching. With real feather fins had been taped to the door. He went to his friend's door and found a similar device. That night at the bar, one could just feel the moral goodness, the marital fidelity emanating from the new character of the warrant officer, as he cast disparaging looks at the officers around him who undoubtedly were planning a night's foraging in the dens of iniquity in nearby Kenville. Several weeks later, in meaningful activity, the warrant officer and the lieutenant saw each other daily and nightly at the club. One Saturday morning, the lieutenant went to his friend's room to begin their daily ritual of going to breakfast together. He was stunned by what he saw on his friend's door: an arrow broken in 2 pieces and retaped to the upper panel of the door. He entered the room without knocking and found his friend staggering around in the fog of the residual joy of Asahi beer. The warrant officer looked sheepishly at his lieutenant friend. "Well, What the hell happened? You broke your vow, didn't you? Indignantly asked the senior officer. Oh, Lord, Jack, pleadingly said his friend. I had to. Jack, I've played with myself so much in the shower that every time it rains I get a hard on. Dear Lord. Okay. Fair. Fair enough. Boy, I like this book. I like it a great deal. But hey, I'll tell you what else. That Asahi beer, I'm going to see if I can pull any over. Or on to whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Get it up here on the internet for us to see. That is some fine beer. The best way I can describe it. Oh, dadgum. Best way I can describe it is if you like Molson Canadian, it's like a harder Molson. A fuller, a richer Molson Canadian. There we go. And interestingly, it's actually prepared, bottled, whatever, by Molson here in North America. Let's see if I can get us an image of it. All right. Asahi beer. Yep, that's it right there. It's a nice lager. Again, it's like a more robust Molson Canadian. That's how I'd describe it anyways. But that's good stuff right there. I'll take that over what's the other ones? That's Sapporo they do. And then what else? Oh, that Kirinichi? Is that? Oh, what's that other one? That is some wild stuff. Yeah. I'm sure some folks are all about it, but I don't even know how to describe this right here. That's some funny beer. But all right, well, that's where we're going to leave off today. Go back, like I said, read Slaughter, subscribe to him, do the whole Substack thing. Make sure you're connected with him on X. He's always putting out good content. And then, yeah, just be aware. Be aware of your media. I'll be curious to see what sort of good stuff y'all have to say. And if you got any thoughts and ideas on this whole what comes first and what are these just merchants? Was there really a movement towards teenagerdom and an extended period of arrested adolescence where you just sort of rest in it? And I'm also curious if you think there were outside factors that led to that, even if you do believe that the teenager thing was foisted on folks. Was it necessarily media that foisted it upon them, or was it the lack of horses? Was it the extended free time? Was it simply that people could have more time to put into their passions and pursuits and turn into bugmen? Which came first, the licensed piece of property or the bugman having enough time to pursue his passions to an extended degree? Well, thank you all for listening. You have a good one.